the editorial of the Financial Times today, which is the newspaper more than any other where big business talks to themselves, to each other. And in their editorial today, they start by saying, short of a communist revolution, it is hard to imagine how governments could have intervened in private markets as quickly and deeply as they have in the past 2 months lockdown. And they go on to say, one may be forgiven for worrying that the pandemic has brought socialism on its coattails. Yet the paradox is that today's emergency measures are necessary to protect the long-term health of the free markets and a capitalist economy. And from their point of view, they're right, that they had to act, they had to intervene in the market on an enormous scale, because if they hadn't have done, it would have led to catastrophe for capitalism and enormous social revolt against it. But it's also clear that they're whistling in the dark to reassure themselves, that they're worried about the fact that a Tory government has carried out state intervention on a scale far bigger than what they were decrying as Marxist when Jeremy Corbyn was threatening to do it a few months ago. They are worried that the existence of a gigantic magic money tree that has been revealed by Johnson's measures will indeed bring socialism on its coattails. Because after all, what they've done poses enormous questions for the majority of society. If they can intervene and nationalise the railway system overnight, and that's what they've done in reality, but very clearly have done it to prop up the rail companies by then paying the existing rail companies money to keep running the railway system. So they've intervened on a big scale to nationalise, but in order to look after big business. But if they can do that, why can't the pharmaceutical companies, the private healthcare industry, the care homes be brought into democratic public ownership and run in the interest of and under the control of the working class? And that question is going to be posed in millions of workers' minds, all the more because it's going to be in the midst of a major economic and social crisis arising from the COVID-19 catastrophe. Most of you will have seen the Bank of England's forecast this week, where they say that Britain is facing the deepest recession in 300 years, that there is going to be a 14% contraction in the size of the economy in 2020, a doubling of unemployment. The Bank of England, whose job it is to try, does that say 5 minutes? You're out of focus. Anyway, don't worry. I'll just carry on because I can't see what it said. The Bank of England, whose job it is to try and put a positive gloss on the state of British capitalism, then say, but kind of don't worry, it's going to be a V. So the recession will be deep, but then it will bounce back very quickly to where we were before. But they're really almost alone in even trying to argue that. Almost immediately, Mervyn King, the ex-governor of the Bank of England, has come in to say there is no way that is going to be the case. The crisis will be much more prolonged. And of course, as we've pointed out, British capitalism and world capitalism was already heading in towards a new recession before the COVID crisis, but all of the negative trends that existed have been enormously exacerbated by what has taken place in the last 2 months. So we've got a major economic disruption coming down the track. But of course, right now, what is still dominant in most workers' minds is the health crisis, is the immediate corona crisis. And there too, British capitalism and the Tory party in particular, as everybody knows, I don't need to tell people in this meeting this, but have been very clearly found wanting. There is no government on the planet that has dealt with the COVID crisis well. But nonetheless, it is very clear that British capitalism and the Tory party are near the bottom of the league table, at least of the advanced capitalist countries. We now have the highest number of official deaths in Europe, And the government have pathetically tried to kind of excuse that by intimating that Britain is better at counting than other countries and therefore has a more accurate picture of how many people have died. But that, unfortunately, is absolutely not the case. The Financial Times have actually done figures working out how far above the normal average are the rates of death in Britain and other countries at the moment. And they've shown that there as well, thanks Tom, that there as well, then the number of deaths across 24 countries, Britain is the highest. They estimate that something like 55,000 people have died so far. Now, why is it that Britain has suffered so particularly badly from the COVID crisis? There are lots of reasons, but the primary reason is that they were so late to do anything. Back on the 12th of March at the first press conference, we all remember that Johnson said many more families are going to lose their loved ones before their time. And then the following day, the chief scientific advisor to the government blurted out the truth about what they meant by that, which was we are waiting for the development of herd immunity and about 40% of the population will have to catch the virus in order for that to develop. That was their strategy. Sit back and do effectively nothing and let the virus rip. And by the way, that is the norm for British capitalism. If you go back historically to 1918 and the biggest pandemic, probably in world history, the flu pandemic that took place then, in Britain, 224,000 people died in that pandemic and nothing was done. The cabinet never discussed it. Parliament only discussed it at the end of the second wave, the most deadly wave of the pandemic. Everything continued to operate. The only thing actually that was employers did was they allowed smoking in the workplace because smoking was thought to stop you getting the flu. But other than that, everything carried on as normal. And you don't have to go back as far as 1918. In 1957, a Tory government under Macmillan did nothing during a flu pandemic. 30,000 people died in that pandemic. The health minister, the Tory health minister at the time, talked about how this is just a news story for the summer silly season. The Tory party conference went ahead and they never even discussed the pandemic that was taking place. So from the point of view of capitalism, if it's not going to affect their profits and the stability of their system, they are quite happy to do nothing about pandemics that develop. This time, of course, it became clear to the Tory government that with the rest of Europe taking action, with Britain set for the highest death rate in Europe, they would face mass revolt and being booted out of office if they'd done nothing. And therefore, they belatedly and hurriedly moved to the lockdown. But it was very belated. The virus was already widespread by that point in time, but also there was a global scramble. And this is a sign of the increased competition between the different capitalist powers. It's been writ large during the COVID pandemic because there was a global scramble, a bun fight to buy PPE, to buy the chemicals necessary for testing and so on. And Britain was at the back of the queue because they weren't even bothering to try until they belatedly moved into the lockdown. And of course then, and I won't spend time on this because I think you all know it, once they began the lockdown and began to try to actually take action to deal with the pandemic, they were in a very parlous state to do so because Britain did have the lowest number of intensive care beds in Europe. They rapidly scrambled to change that, but the fact that they've had to close the Nightingale Hospital in London, it partly reflects that the NHS has not been overwhelmed, but actually the primary reason they're not able to use it is because you can build intensive care beds, but you can't create intensive care staff overnight, and they have not had sufficient qualified staff in order to run that facility. A young comrade in London was actually being trained to work in there, and they were talking about sending her in for after 3 days training to do taking people's bloods, looking after their vital signs and so on, and it wasn't viable to do that without at least some qualified staff in order to oversee the situation. And we know the lack of PPE, the fact that in 2016, the British government was warned the NHS would be overwhelmed in a pandemic, and their response to that was to run down the stockpiles of PPE even further, leaving them 40% smaller than they had been a decade ago. The lack of capacity for testing, and by the way, as you can read in a very good article by John Dale in Socialist today this month, the responsibility for that lay not with the Tory government, but with New Labour in office and what they did to the laboratory service that previously existed under the auspices of the NHS. Now, thanks Tom, in the first phase of the crisis, despite the complete hash they were making of it, the Tories, the government, has obviously remained high in the opinion polls. That's beginning to change. It hasn't completely changed as yet. And there is, from a number of points of view, a comparison here that we and others have made with the early stages of a war. First of all, when you have a national emergency, there is a natural feeling of we better not joggle the people in charge's elbow. It's a bit like you're in an out of control car. You might think the driver's a lunatic, but you don't necessarily try and wrestle the steering wheel from them at that moment in time. So people saved up their criticisms for later because the government were the people dealing with the crisis. But of course, that was also accompanied by this gigantic campaign for national unity. We're all in this together, the government are acting in our best interests, etc., etc. And I think there is a whole generation, this is an aside, but have seen for themselves the character of capitalist propaganda in the course of this pandemic. The relentless message from the BBC and every media outlet at the beginning about how we've all got to stay at home, about how the responsibility for spreading the virus lies with people who spent longer than an hour doing their daily exercise or gone too close to somebody in a park. And of course, we're in favour of social distancing measures, but that was a distraction from the government's responsibility for the crisis. And now overnight, they've switched it. And all of a sudden, building up to tomorrow's announcement from Johnson, it's about how it's your national duty to start thinking about going back to work. We can't let the economy grind to a halt, etc., etc. But that shift is also part of a breaking down of that initial phase of national unity, because there is no easy way for the capitalist class out of this crisis. They don't have a vaccine, they don't have sufficient testing, they want to reopen the economy, and there is a big push by a section of the capitalist class to reopen the economy, but they are also frightened if they do that and then there's a second wave, they could suffer worse economic and social consequences as a result of that. So they're divided on the way forward, and increasingly big sections of them are openly criticising Johnson. It's been commented on in the media that Keir Starmer, the new leader of the Labour Party, is starting to do a more effective job of criticising Johnson. And, you know, it's true. In his loyally way, at this week's parliamentary Prime Minister's questions, he did manage to score some blows against Johnson. I mean, it's not a very big achievement, is it? Let's face it. When you've got a government that showed off about how they were going to go to Turkey and buy all these PPE supplies, and then it takes them 2 weeks to get the supplies, and then it turns out that the supplies are not up to standard and they can't even use them. Absolutely anybody should be able to score a few blows against the government. But nonetheless, it's an improvement on what Johnson was doing, what Starmer was doing at the previous week's parliamentary questions, where he was still talking about the government's approach to this crisis being, to quote, an amazing piece of work. What kind of opposition is that? But what his change of tone reflects is a change of tone by sections of the capitalist class. The Financial Times this week ran an interview with Starmer, the kind of summary of which was the government was too slow to lock down, and now it's too slow to make a plan to reopen. Starmer is reflecting the pressure of a section of the capitalist class who want to move to reopen the economy. He is not criticising the government from the point of view of the interests of working class people. And you want proof of that? Listen to the interview he did on Radio 4 earlier this week. 3 times on the Today programme, he was asked if he would support workers who refused to work because it was not safe for them to do so. And 3 times he refused to say he would support those workers. His refusal to answer says it all. Now, having said that, this breakdown in the kind of national unity narrative and the increased criticism between different sections of the capitalist class, combined with, thanks Tom, growing anger from below, is also putting pressure on the trade union leaders to begin to separate themselves from the national unity narrative. Because unfortunately, at the start of this crisis, almost completely, the union leaders were sucked into, as Mark Savotka put it, a supposedly left leader, parking the demands of their workers until after the crisis in order to back the government. A completely wrong approach, but events of the last week have started to force them to change. You will have seen that early this week, Frances O'Grady actually made a statement criticising the government, the leader of the TUC. She did it after the government on a Sunday night approached the TUC and gave them 11 hours to comment on their proposals for coming out of lockdown. And the TUC, Frances O'Grady's response was they wanted to be able to recommend those proposals, but they could not because they were so bad. And when you read them, because the government then proceeded to leak them as soon as the TUC would not sign up, there are 7 different documents. Every single one of them says under the heading PPE, guidance to follow. And of course, the reason it says that is because the PPE is to follow. They don't have enough PPE to carry out proper safety measures for a reopening of the economy. On social distancing, it says it's not always possible for employers to have 2 meters social distancing, so they should do all they reasonably can. That leaves an enormous gap for employers to decide to prioritise their profits rather than workers' safety. And we know already that London Underground Limited, for example, have been arguing that safe social distancing is 0.5 metre, not 2 metres, in order to try and get the London Underground up and running again. So it was so bad that the TUC were not able to sign up to it. They didn't do what they should have done, though. They should have given an immediate press conference explaining how the government was trying to bounce them into backing this charter for risking workers' health, and then saying clearly that the trade union movement as a whole would not support workers returning to work without proper PPE, without proper testing for all, and without proper safety measures. Look, let's be clear, the working class is suffering worse from the virus, is also suffering worse from the lockdown. There are now something like 2 million people who've had to apply for universal credit. There are millions of people who cannot afford to feed their children. Being stuck at home, homeschooling your kids, is a hell of a lot worse if you live in a tiny flat without a garden. The working class is suffering worse from the lockdown. It's not that we want lockdown to continue per se, but we do not trust, and the union movement should not trust, the government and the employers to decide when it's safe to return. It has to be for the workers' movement, for the trade unions, to decide what is safe to return, and in the meantime, fight for full pay for all for those that are still at home. And actually, despite the weakness of the trade union leaders, the trade union movement is actually in a powerful position in this situation, which is not lost on important sections of the working class. Even the fact that the government are looking to the TUC to give them cover, that they want to get the TUC on board to be backing their proposals, is a sign of the potential power of the trade unions. They can't just ignore the trade union movement. They have to take what the trade unions are saying into an account. We were discussing it in the Socialist Party Executive Committee earlier this week, speculating about what Johnson is going to say tomorrow. Obviously, we don't know exactly what Johnson is going to say tomorrow, but one of the points we made is that if the teachers' unions showed even a tiny little bit of backbone, they could stop the schools reopening until it is safe to do so. And actually, the statement today by the teaching and the other unions involved in education could be enough to stop the schools being reopened, because of the pressure they're putting on to say they should not be opened is currently not safe to do so. Now, thanks, Tom. Even where that happens, even if that happens, of course, then that is not going to prevent other sections of the workforce being pushed back. And in fact, that's already happening, because Britain's legal lockdown was very weak. It has been social pressure that has shut parts of construction, and above all trade union pressure, parts of manufacturing and so on. And that is now beginning to reopen. And we have to demand the unions act nationally using the health and safety legislation, not to call strikes in the sense of blatantly defying the anti-union laws, but saying clearly we are opposed to our members going back when it's not safe. We will back them not going back. And in addition, saying it is clearly not safe in this industry, in these workplaces, etc., etc. We have to fight for that nationally, but we also have to fight urgently that the structures of the trade unions reopen, because many of them have just not been meeting. We can meet via Zoom, the trade unions can meet via Zoom. They have to urgently reopen at every level, and we have to fight for action, even where it doesn't take place nationally, to be organised on a local level. And I think we should be prepared for quite a significant wave of action, primarily over health and safety. It's already happening at local level, like the Southampton bus drivers who refused to take their buses out yesterday because they hadn't been cleaned, and demanded they were deep cleaned before they were willing to do so. Those kind of actions are taking place up and down the country. And actually, the working class is looking towards the trade unions to a greater extent now than at any time since 2011. There's been a surge in trade union membership, and where there are trade union meetings to go to, a surge of workers attending the trade unions as they look to the unions to help navigate them through this crisis. I would just add, while I think the industrial issues are going to be the main thing in the immediate period, we should also be aware that as the lockdown begins to ease, we can begin to see more of other forms of struggle as well. It's a very limited example, but in my local area via the Trades Council, we organised a socially distant car cavalcade because it's Newham, the borough that's had the most deaths in the country, against poverty and austerity for PPE and so on. But we had about 25, mostly local Labour Party activists turn out, and they had all been written to by the leader of the Labour group telling them no Labour Party member should go on this protest, but they turned out anyway. And it's just a bit of an indication of people beginning to be prepared to act. Now, all of this is important for the immediate period, but even more for what is coming afterwards. Because the fact that workers are looking towards the trade unions, and also generally, in our view, there's been a raising of class consciousness in a certain sense during this crisis, particularly amongst the essential workers, because after all, people who've been told that their jobs are worthless, that they're paid the minimum wage because what they do doesn't matter, are the people who have kept society running, that governments have been forced to hypocritically come out and clap, and they know that, and that has increased the confidence of working class people that they have power in society. And that will be very important for the new world that we're going to be facing in the aftermath of this crisis. A severe recession taking place and severe attacks on the living conditions of the working class majority. Johnson, of course, has said that he doesn't like the word austerity. And that's partly just Johnsonian populism, because he knows full well that what was done by Osborne and Cameron was enormously unpopular. The biggest cuts in public spending that had taken place since the 1930s. But it doesn't only represent that. It also represents the fact that capitalism's in such a severe crisis that they've had to carry out this enormous increase in public spending in order to prop up the capitalist system. And they know full well they will not be able to just reverse that. They're going to have to continue with a level of continued state intervention in order to prop up the capitalist system. But we shouldn't be under any illusion that that is going to be to benefit the working class. That is going to be against the background, thanks Tom, of the capitalist class trying to make us pay for the COVID crisis and the economic crisis that follows. They're doing it already. The British Airways layoffs that have taken place and the threat that they actually lay off 3/4 of their entire workforce and re-employ some of them on worse terms and conditions, that is British Airways management trying to force through the attacks on their workforce that they've wanted to do for a decade under the cover of the COVID crisis. The same with Royal Mail. They've been pushed back by the union and the workers, but nonetheless, that is what Royal Mail have been trying to do and are continuing to try and do under the COVID crisis. And we know in the aftermath of this, the economic crisis that is coming will be an enormous disruption of the capitalist system, with every sector, particularly those that affect young people, but not only, but the hospitality, retail, etc., but also the universities are going to be facing a major crisis. But every sector of society is going to be in upheaval economically, and the capitalist class are going to try and use that to increase their profits and to drive down the share that is taken by the working class. So we're going to be facing mass struggles across a whole host of different fields. I don't think we can say exactly what form those are going to take at this point in time. But just to point to a few that can come quite quickly down the road, there is obviously the question of the NHS, where what has been done to the NHS has been revealed to society in the course of this crisis. And NHS workers are actually going to be in quite a powerful position to say, we're not taking this anymore. We demand better pay, and the possibility of a movement around the NHS has to be posed, also on the question of social care. But the other issue that is likely to come up in our view is the question of housing. At this time, that's mainly been propaganda. But once the immediate crisis is over, the evictions will start on a big scale of workers who've been made unemployed and cannot afford to pay their rent or possibly their mortgages. And the question of movements around that can also be posed. We have to be prepared for riots. And possibly, by the way, riots in the sense we haven't seen since the 1930s, food riots, where people are literally rioting. There was an element of that in 2011, but to a much bigger extent, people rioting because they do not have enough to eat, and possibly on a more organised way, taking foods from the supermarkets and so on. So we can see all kinds of social movements, but also a big opportunity for the trade unions, where workers are looking towards the trade unions for a greater extent than has been the case for a whole period. And we are already at the forefront of the battles to transform the trade unions into fighting democratic organisations. But I think we have a much bigger layer of workers around us in that process than we did before this economic crisis. There's also the question of youth unemployment, which undoubtedly is going to exist on a big scale, and organising against that. Alongside the various social and industrial movements that can develop, there's obviously also the question of political representation of the working class. And I've not left much time to talk about this, so just a couple of headlines. Starmer's victory marks the end of a period in which a possible route, and to many workers it seemed a likely route, to getting their own political voice was around Corbyn and the Corbyn wing of the Labour Party. But as we consistently pointed out, that could only have been achieved if a battle had taken place to transform the Labour Party into a workers' party with a socialist programme, and that meant removing democratically the Blairites from their positions in the Parliamentary Labour Party, in the council chambers, in the Labour Party machine. But unfortunately, that is not what took place. There was a process of endless compromise with the Blairite wing, which allowed Starmer's policy on Brexit to be the policy in the last election, with the consequences that we all saw. And that means Starmer's election means he's not walking into a Corbynite party. He's walking into a party which in large part still has a pro-capitalist position, and he can just take the leadership. But the working class need its own voice more than ever in this crisis, and therefore that issue is going to be posed. We need a mass party of the working class. Now, you might say, yeah, but don't you just want people to join the Socialist Party? And let's be clear, yes, we want everybody who agrees with what we're saying to join the Socialist Party. And we're recruiting rapidly at the moment, even in lockdown, in large part because of people who had hopes in Jeremy Corbyn and now feel that that is over and have decided to join the Socialist Party. But we, of course, have drawn quite definite conclusions about what it means to fight for socialism. That it is not possible to tinker around the edges, to make socialism, to make capitalism into a nicer system. That what is necessary is to bring into democratic public ownership the major corporations and banks that dominate the economy, and to build a new democratic socialist order. And then that cannot just be done from the top by governments. That requires the active participation of the working class. And we want everyone who agrees with that to join us. But we also recognise, thanks Tom, that there will be millions of people who go from their current position, not directly to everything that we currently think, but will first say, we need to get active to fight back against what this system means. We've got to fight for decent housing. We've got to fight to save the health service. We've got to fight for decent jobs. And we say that we want to unite with all of those people in a mass party of the working class where we fight together on those issues while we discuss how socialism can be achieved. You can't say from this point exactly how such a mass voice for the working class will come into being. But you can say it will come out of struggle and that we are facing major struggles. And let's look just a little way down the road. Elections all got cancelled this year. Next May, there's going to be quite a lot of elections. And I know, for example, in my area in Newham, we supposedly have a Corbynite mayor. She's carrying out £45 million worth of cuts. She's done nothing effective while we suffer the highest rate of deaths in the country. And there are many working class activists in and outside the Labour Party who are going to be fighting against her policies for the next year. And if they can't select candidates who are actually anti-cuts, who are actually prepared to stand up for the working class in our borough in the Labour Party, are going to be wanting to stand in next year's election. So you can see out of how the struggles we're involved in, the question of a political alternative can begin to be posed. But the most important immediate job that we face is that there are undoubtedly thousands of people around the country who are looking at this crazy situation like nothing else we've ever lived through. Many of them at the moment are home in their houses, looking at it on the TV and out of the window, rather than in real life, but they're thinking about the need for a different kind of society to this one. They're looking towards socialist ideas, and we can reach them and recruit them to the Socialist Party, perhaps initially via Zoom, and then in the not too distant future, meet them in real life. I'll leave it there.